Hi everyone, this is Jamie, and welcome to another episode of the Yogi Within podcast. Okay, so on today's episode, uh, someone asked me this question a while ago, but actually it was a meeting I had with someone else in the yoga community in Oslo last week that made me want to talk about this today. And the question is really, are yoga studios in decline or dying out? And is there a transition that's going on in the yoga community in the way that people practice, and potentially studios closing, and potentially teachers not wanting to teach anymore? And I think that this is something that is happening, and I thought it would be good to talk about it. And as usual, I'll try and talk about this in a balanced and nuanced way. And the answer to this is kind of yes and no. And I think that there are some changes going on within the way yoga is being taught and the relationship students or members have to their space and their teacher. And this has probably been going on for some time, especially since COVID. And the way that people are learning yoga these days, and the relationship they have to practices, and potentially their teacher, and the way this has shifted potentially to more online practice, and really maybe people wanting to go to spaces in a different way. So I'm going to try and talk about this in different ways. But the reason I wanted to talk about this was because I had a really... How's the best way to describe this? I saw the opposite ends of two spectrums this week in yoga. I visited a teacher who has been teaching at a studio in Oslo probably for a couple of decades, and teaches a very sort of traditional form of hatha yoga in a very simple school not too far from where I teach. And he's a lovely guy, and we sat down, we talked for some time and shared some reflections on his studio and practice and how that shifted. And then I had a kind of stark comparison the same week of a very modern a modern yoga studio, and really the kind of trends that are associated with modern yoga. And these were two different worlds, and I would say that I'm old enough and young enough in some ways to appreciate both. And I think that it's interesting to talk about the way that they're different, and why, potentially this kind of traditional studio might close someday soon. And I'm going to talk about the economic reasons, but also the shift in the way people are exposed to yoga and what they want, or what they think they want. So this guy has got this very traditional studio, and I as soon as I went into this space, I've not been there before, I felt a lot of yoga in that space, and it reminded me of when I first started practicing, and my first sort of visits to a yoga studio back in the day. And these were not fancy studios, my first experience of yoga was really, basic rooms that were not studios. It was basic, people that were renting a space to teach traditional practices that were kind of just rooms that were being rented out quite cheaply. And, you were paying a relatively modest amount of money to come and practice there. And it wasn't so business orientated. It was more just someone sharing what they had experienced. And my experience of first practicing yoga was like that. It was kind of not underground, but not mainstream for sure. It was very basic. There wasn't a monetary aspect to it. It was very sort of simple in a way. And visiting this guy's studio reminded me of that. And like I say, I felt a lot of yoga in that space. I met a very calm older gentleman who had a lot of time and patience to sit and talk with me for some time. And it was a very lovely conversation around yoga practice. And like I say, I felt a lot of yoga in that room. It reminded me of why I got into yoga. It reminded me of why I was drawn to spaces like that. You know, I was drawn to sort of being in these traditional spaces that were not fancy and simple, and you could feel there was a lot of warmth and integrity and authenticity in that space, and you felt like you could learn something there, and you felt like you could learn something that wasn't really about asana or stretching. You felt like you could learn something that was really about the deeper core aspects of practicing yoga. And this guy embodied that. Yeah, he wasn't a stressed, rushed businessman. He wasn't someone who was wealthy and doing this as a side hobby because it was kind of cool. He was doing this because he cared, and he wanted to share practices that obviously had helped him and changed his life. And, you know, we discussed how he first got into yoga, and really, you know, back in the day, it was normally, you know, a lot of hippies or alternative people that were doing these things, and it wasn't very kind of popular and wasn't really well known, and maybe even frowned upon a little bit and looked down upon, or, you know, obscurity. People weren't really sure what these things were, so, you know, it wasn't so popular. Now, again, I felt a lot of yoga in this room. You know, I could feel it. I wanted to do my own practice in this room. I remember being in this space thinking, I would like to practice in this room. I had a sense that I would be able to sort of go somewhere in that space. For people who have a self-practice, you'll know what I mean. Some spaces and some rooms, there's a feeling there. There's a depth to it. There was nothing superficial or externally focused in this room. It had soul. That's the word. It had some sort of soul, and you could feel that lots of bodies and lots of people would pass through that room, and there was something you might experience in that space that could be authentic. And I felt that a lot from a lot of traditional places that I practiced at early on in my yoga days, and at different rooms I'd practiced in, and they were definitely not externally focused. It wasn't sort of a fancy room or a fancy building with fancy showers and mirrors and crystals and lots of different kind of modern alternative things that are in yogashalas. They were very simple, basic rooms. And I like that. So I have a relationship to yoga in that way. It was some nostalgia and something that reminded me of why I kind of got into yoga. Those kinds of spaces, the smells of those kinds of rooms, how basic they were, and the kind of people that you met in those rooms, to me was yoga. So I have that relationship to that world, you know, being in spaces like that. And then, you know, fast forward to being in a modern studio, this feels completely different to me. You know, you could feel it. There's a completely different kind of energy. You can feel the sort of monetary side of things, the sort of externalization of things. And you can feel that it's much more focused on how things look. You know, you can see that division and that parallel. And I'm not saying that that's inherently completely wrong. It's just those worlds are very different. And what I could see in the old world was something that might be dying a little bit. That was the feeling I got from being in this space, that world might be kind of dying out somewhat, and that relationship to yoga might be on its way out in some ways, especially as people really only understand yoga in the modern world for these modern types of studios where it's, you know, set in a certain way, set in a certain environment that definitely has more of a focus on stretching and strength work, and largely asana focused, but also it's more about the vibe of the room. You know, I think it's a little bit hard to describe into words, but I would say a lot of modern yoga studios have more of a external aesthetic and more of a focus on how things look. And they definitely have a kind of gym, fitness, kind of membership energy to them, rather than a relationship to a school and a teacher. And I think that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about on this podcast today. And these two worlds were very different, yeah? You know, it reminded me of the first gym I went to in London, which was a bit the same as this yoga school. Yeah, it was a rundown, spit and sawdust kind of place. That I do a quick story on this, but my dad's uncle, was a bodybuilder. Weirdly, back in the day, which wasn't a common thing, and he used to work at the Old Vic Theatre in London, if anyone knows that, in Waterloo. And he was kind of the janitor there, and he had like a gym in the basement there that he'd had there for years. And as a teenager, he used to train me, and getting into boxing and things like that. And then a friend of his is called Dave Prowse, and you might know him. He was the guy that played Darth Vader in Star Wars. He had a gym in South London, and his two sons used to run the gym. And I used to go there for free as a teenager, as long as I did a bit of work there. So I used to kind of pick up the weights and tidy up, which I didn't really do, but I used to train there for free. That's how I got into sort of lifting weights and powerlifting a little bit as a teenager. But this place was very it was a family place. Yeah, you knew everyone knew you, everyone was kind of friends at this gym, and it was great. I met lifelong friends from being in that space, yeah, as a teenager. Like, made friends I still know from today. Yeah, this was when I was 15, probably. Yeah, and it was great. It was a family place. Lots of great memories. It had nothing to do with how it looked, or it was really just about a community space, and it was fun. Knew everyone. It was great. I had great memories from that. And obviously, you had the kind of chain gyms that were around that area as well, down in South London near Borough Market. But people went there because they loved it, and they loved that kind of space. And that was my first entry into sort of training a little bit, was spaces like that. It wasn't so much about membership fees and prices and discounts, and it was just about community, really. And you knew that your membership, like the price you was paying, was helping that community stay alive. It was helping it kind of build and grow. And paying your membership wasn't just about trying to find the cheapest price. It was because you wanted that space to stay open. It was a relationship. Yeah, there was a relationship to that space. Fast forward, I've practiced at different yoga studios. I've trained at different gyms, the kind of chain gyms where you go in and you don't know anyone. You go in, you train, you go home. It's cold, it's kind of empty, really. It doesn't really have any relationship. You don't really meet anyone there. You don't really have any friends or know anyone there. You just kind of go, you do your thing and leave, and it's cold and it's kind of soulless. There's no energy in that space. It's just kind of disconnected. And then, my martial arts days was very much like a community space again. All your friends were there. All the people that you knew were there. You had a strong relationship to your coaches, your mentors, and the price that you paid was kind of, it didn't really matter. Like, as long as you weren't being ripped off, it was more about, like, I would have paid my membership just to keep the place going. It wasn't about the price of the membership. It was because of what it gave you. I knew that my coaches were giving all of their energy into that space. And then us as students, we weren't clients, we weren't members, we were students. And that relationship made that place gold. It was such a powerful room because it wasn't about money. It wasn't about, profit and turning a profit. It was someone teaching you something that they cared about, that they dedicated their life to. And you were grateful for that. I was grateful that my coaches were there doing that. Yeah, it wasn't like, I wasn't thinking, well, I can get a 20% discount down the road if I go there. It was a relationship, yeah. And I think that's the main thing that makes things the best, is when you have a relationship to a space and as a teacher or a group of people, and you're making friends and there's a community being built in the space that you go to. It's not about money, yeah. Those spaces are gold. If you find a space like that, cherish it and look after it, because they don't last forever. And be grateful that people open and create spaces like that, because Oslo and London, everywhere is full of chain gyms that are soulless and dead, and don't really give you anything. You go in, you practice, you leave. No one knows your name. No one cares about you. You don't have any real memories there. It's just soulless. You go there, you do your thing, and you leave. And I think that, if studios like that are closing, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. The whole chain gym, chain yoga studios, I think they have their value in some way from the fact that people go there and use them. But I don't think they really give anything to communities. I don't think they really build anything. It's more a monetary thing and a business thing. And I think that if studios and spaces are closing, I don't think it's such a bad thing if those places leave. I don't think people are really going to miss those places. I think what's sad is if, legitimate, genuine places that have authentic teachers close. I think that that's what I felt from this space that I visited recently, that the chap, he might be closing that space sometime in the near future. And I thought that was sad. And I think it's sad that spaces like that aren't valued as much anymore, because people just are really thinking about membership prices and getting discounts and really chasing the sort of modern style of yoga where it's less of a community and more just like a gym membership. And I think that yoga studio owners are a little bit responsible for that, because to be competitive, they're changing their pricing schemes and their models to be competitive. But what they're doing, they're not really thinking about the bigger picture, in my view. The bigger picture being that if you turn your membership model of your yoga studio into a gym membership kind of model, then you're kind of devaluing what you do, in my opinion. You're devaluing your teachers, and you're telling people that practice with you that we're basically a gym. It's got the same kind of energy of a fitness studio. And to me, this creates a transient environment, and it creates an environment where people don't really appreciate what you're doing. Yeah. Fitness studios and things like that have their place, and it's cool that people go there. But, this is largely taught by relatively unskilled people in essence, that can teach classes of fitness and teach you where to put your hand in your leg and get a workout. And I don't mean that I'm not devaluing those people, that there's a place for that. But that's got nothing to do with someone who's dedicated their life to a religious practice that's trying to teach you the deeper values of something. That doesn't get this is not a gym membership. This is not a class pass. This isn't a quick fix. This isn't something that should be categorized in the same way. And I think what's sad is that yoga studios and yoga classes and practices have become so watered down that they really are now viewed in the same way as a gym membership or some sort of class pass that you might get. And I think that that's sad. I think that it's sad that that's really happened. And looking at those two worlds this week, visiting this guy's yoga studio, that's a yoga studio. I don't even like calling it a studio, really, a shala. It's a school, a place of learning, love, devotion. There was a religious element to being in this space. You could tell that someone had devoted their life to teaching something that was beyond stretching and strength work. What I see a lot in the modern yoga community is not that. It's more about the physicality of yoga, and really that's it. There isn't much more to it than that, than just getting a workout, stretching. And, there's benefit to that. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that doesn't have a benefit, but they're very different things. They feel different. There's a different connection to spaces like that. And I think that this is probably the shift that's been going on in yoga for some time, where those spaces that I'm talking about are becoming much less, and the people that teach at those places might potentially stop doing that, because really, if you're an authentic yoga teacher, you don't really want to teach these things to people that don't value it. If you're someone who's practicing yoga and you just see where you're going as some sort of fitness stretching center, and your goal is to just get a cheap price, and you don't really care about the space or the teacher that much, and you just use it as some sort of paid for service, then I think that that's sad. And I think that really that's what's happened to a lot of the yoga world, is that because it's become more of a gym fitness industry, you don't have students anymore. You have clients and members, and those clients and members see those spaces as a paid for service. Yeah. When I was practicing at my martial arts clubs, this was not a paid service. I never saw this as a paid service. I saw this as a teacher-student relationship that I was grateful for. These are different things, yeah? A paid service is you pay for a service because you expect something. You have an expectation about something you've paid for, and then you want that to be a certain way. So maybe, which is what you see in a lot of modern yoga studios, people will complain because they didn't get the service they want. It's some sort of service model. This isn't a teacher-student relationship. The goal of an authentic yoga teacher is not to make you feel better. Yeah, probably, most likely, maybe even 90% of the time, you will feel good at the end of your session practicing yoga, but that's not the goal. The goal isn't to sell you a service. Yeah, this isn't some watered down sales model to make you feel better. Yeah, I think this is what's largely happened to yoga, where it's turned into some wellness kind of package that the goal is to sell you something to make you feel good. And if you don't get that, then you had a bad service. Unfortunately, this has also happened to the martial arts community, yeah, where I think it's moved more into the American market, and I think a lot of American, I'm not talking down to Americans, it's just what I've witnessed from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu moving to the States predominantly, is a lot of American schools are seeing this in that same way. And I've heard American professors and teachers talk about it like that, that really the main thing is that people have a paid for service and that it's a service they're paying for. I don't see it like that. I never saw it like that. I never learnt it that way from my Brazilian coaches. It was completely, and Japanese coaches, it's a relationship to a school. It's not a paid for service. I think that when you start seeing something as a paid for service, it devalues what that is. And it's just, what is it? It doesn't really mean that much. It's not a relationship. It's just something you pay for. It's easy come, easy go. And it doesn't really mean anything. And I think that that's sad. And I think that the more yoga moves more into this gym membership, fitness area, I think the more you're going to see that, and the more students won't be students anymore. There will be clients and members, and it will be more transient, more quick fix, and more about people wanting some sort of feel-good factor, and that's not right. If they don't get that, you're not really learning anything, and there's not really any community. And I think that there isn't really much community in those kinds of spaces, because I think that people value it in a different way. And I think the commercialization of yoga is great, that more people are doing it and it's more accessible, but I also think that it's becoming much more watered down in that way, and you have much more hobbyist teachers who don't value it in the same way, and then people are just trying to outcompete each other by just doing price reductions and membership reductions, because it's just the way that they can compete with each other like a gym would, and it just devalues and waters down the whole thing. And I think if you're new to yoga, you don't really know the difference. You go to a yoga studio and it's like, okay, my back hurts and I'm going to go here. And this place is good because it's got a nice studio and their memberships are cheaper, so I'm just going to go there. And not really understanding that what's happening is that this is devaluing what other people are doing who've dedicated their lives to a practice to teach you the deeper aspects of religious practices of yoga. They're very different things. I think it's good to think about this in that way, that there is a shift. And like I say, I saw this night and day comparison this week between these two spaces. And like I say, I'm old enough and young enough to kind of appreciate both. They both have their good qualities, but I think that the shift is largely to do with that. And I think that what makes people happy is community. What makes people feel like life is worth living is when they're connected to people and that they feel close to people, and they're around people who share a common goal and a common interest, and they're there for each other. Yeah, this happens. I've seen this in my own shala, where some students are going through difficult times, and some practitioners have allowed people to stay at their home, or they look after their pets, or there's a community there. People care about each other. Yeah, and this, you have to, let's phrase this right, you have to participate in that. Yeah, it's great a teacher holds space for that and creates that, but as students you have to participate in that. Yeah, I felt this strongly at my martial arts club. You get out what you put in. If you're going to a transient chain gym or studio, you're not going to get that, really. Yeah, when you find these smaller spaces, I think, where people are trying to create a community space like that, you have to participate, you have to support those spaces, and you have to put that energy in. It's a relationship, it's not a paid for service. I think if you're viewing it as a paid for service, then I think that that's sad, and I think that you're only really going to get that from it. You're not really going to get too much else from that. And I think really that's what yoga is about. It's about community. It's a sangha. You're trying to create a community of people who share a common goal, share a common interest, who care about each other, care about each other's progressions, practice. You feel connected to those people. You feel connected to that space. There's a love energy there. This to me is what a yoga space should be about, not just competing with other people for price reductions and discounts and this, that and the other. I think it devalues what people are doing, and I don't think really communities are really established in places like that. It's totally in and out, quick fix, 60-minute classes, everyone's in a hurry. I think that this is the kind of modern gym style, fitness style relationship to yoga. I think that it has its place, don't get me wrong, they all have their place. I think that there's benefits to that, but I think that it's also why people don't value it in the same way, and why those spaces might kind of die out. And I think that there's the authentic teachers I know that are still holding spaces like that. To me, they're gold. Like, the things that you learn and the vibe that you get from spaces like that is unmatched. Yeah, it's unmatched. It's not even in the same ballpark. You can go to a class and have a good yoga class and feel good and get looser and stuff, but that is not in the same universe as a community space where a relationship is being built between you, the teacher, and your fellow practitioners, your sangha. It's a completely different thing. Yeah, I think this also falls into the wellness thing. I see this a lot with practitioners where I think they do see it as a paid service. It's like, I'm paying you for this and I want you to fix my back, or I'm paying you for this because I want this or I want that. And they do see it as a paid for service, and this is incorrect. This is not yoga practice. You're not paying for a service. It's not like going to a chiropractor or an osteopath and getting a quick fix, and if you don't get that quick fix, then something's wrong. This is not established in that way. The things that are learnt through your body, the changes that go in your body take time. And a good authentic yoga teacher and space will understand that these things take time. A relationship is established between the teacher and the student in the space, and these things have to propagate over time. They have to open and change over time. This is not a quick fix. Yoga is not a transient quick thing. Bodily changes, structural changes in the body are not quick fix things. Yeah, you're not going there for a quick fix, for something to just magically happen. The best things in religious and spiritual practices take time, and understanding that is a correct methodology. If you're going somewhere for a quick fix, I think that you're not going to get that from an authentic yoga studio, and it's not taught that way. It shouldn't be taught that way. And I think that's why authentic teachers and spaces understand that. And really, you're kind of looking for students to also understand what you're trying to teach them in that way. And I think that's unfortunately why some really legit teachers are probably stepping away from teaching yoga, actually. And I think that is a really sad thing. If the really good, authentic teachers out there might just give up a little bit one day, I think, because if your student base is becoming transient clients and members who are expecting quick fixes and are not committing to a space with devotion and love and trying to create a relationship, I think the authentic teachers out there will just give up. It's like you only really want to convey that information and that wisdom to people that really want to learn that, not people that are just going to complain and moan because they're not getting what they want when they want. It's not a paid for service. It was never that when I was learning martial arts. It was not like I'm going to complain because I didn't get what I wanted this week. You understood that your professor and your teacher was trying to teach you something deeper. Yeah, they're trying to establish something in you that takes time to learn. And as a student, you're receptive to that. You're open to that. You're open to that path. Yeah, your teacher's like, I can show you this, but it's not going to be easy and it might take some time. And all I'm asking for you to do is trust me and commit to that. And actually, some of this might come down to trust. Yeah, you see a lot of skepticism in students. They have skepticism around these practices and what you're trying to teach them. And it's usually because they want something to happen in a certain time frame and they're skeptical that that might not happen. And again, it's this quick fix, easy, in and out, non-committal. It's kind of a little bit avoidant behavior. And really, that doesn't work. Yeah, you have to, like Ian Greisack, we talked about this word surrender. I wouldn't go that far, but committing to a relationship is one thing. Committing to something over time and seeing where it goes. Yeah, this is part of devotional practice. Yeah, it's a participation in something deeper. It's a trust thing. You have to trust. Like, I have faith and trust in the Ashtanga Yoga system. I'm critical to aspects of it. I had a lot of faith and trust in my first teacher, Ian Greisack. I trusted his wisdom and his knowledge, and I accepted I was going to see where that went, even though at times it didn't make sense. I didn't understand it. Some parts of it I thought, well, this doesn't make sense to me, but I trust this man, and I have my faith in him as a person to see where this goes, and I've received the most benefit from that. My professors in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Judo and stuff, I trusted them. They'd walked the walks and walked that path for decades. I knew what they were legit. I was like, right, I trust this person to see where this goes. I'm going to see where this goes. And I received massive benefit from that. Not being skeptical, not wishy-washy, not transient and avoidant. Yeah, these things don't really benefit students. And I think that the transient nature of modern yoga is, I think, enabling that a little bit more. I'll just talk a little bit about the economical side of this. Times are difficult lately, monetary, I think, for a lot of people, and some cultures and countries are set up a little bit differently. I would say that Norway and Oslo is not set up for small businesses. The government are just not set up that way. And I think that a lot of small businesses struggle. And unfortunately, a lot of buildings in Oslo and, London and many New York, a lot of cities are owned by big conglomerates. And they don't really care what kinds of business are in their neighborhoods. They don't care. They just mostly care about incremental profit. So what I've seen a lot in neighborhoods is small businesses closing down because of rent increases by conglomerates who don't care what businesses are there. They don't care what kinds of spaces are being served in their community. It could be something that benefits kids and adults. It doesn't really matter. What they mostly care about is turning a profit. So, chain coffee shops, chain gyms come in and eat that up because they can afford the rent. And I think that's also something that's happening in the yoga world where, just trying to make ends meet is becoming more difficult. So small community spaces are dying off. That's definitely a thing. I think that's been going on since COVID, really. And I think that's also why some spaces are closing, because it's just becoming harder to do that. And I think, again, with the transient nature of students and clients and members, who are not supporting those spaces. They're looking for the cheaper deal, and the cheaper deal is normally at bigger studios or more generic, gyms with multiple locations and cheap class passes, and people are drawn to that because it's cheaper. And I think that's killing some of the smaller businesses, and unfortunately the authentic ones are those ones. So again, if you really care about authentic practices and you don't like chain gyms and studios, you have to support these places, especially during harder times, because otherwise I think they will close off. And talking to this chap recently, I think this is definitely one of the reasons why that's happening. And a lot of people will complain when those things close and are not open, but you have to support them. You have to support those places if you care about them. You have to pay for what you care about. So I think that's definitely a factor. And economics. Also, I think COVID affected a lot of places. I heard a lot of studios closed down because of COVID, like just the whole proximity thing. Ashtanga yoga, for example, the whole adjustment side of things is a thing. I've also heard of gyms, Sharla's closing because people worried about getting sued, with adjustments and things. Some cultures in some countries are very much into that, and, it just makes it more difficult. And I think that people are trying to pass on authentic traditions. At some point they'll just give up, really. If if you're an authentic teacher, what you're looking for really is to see if there are students that are open to that thing that you're trying to convey. No one wants to teach anything to people that don't care. What I understood from the practices I learnt from Ian and my old martial arts clubs was that's quite rare in a way. It's quite rare to meet people that have dedicated their whole lives to something and studied something at a very deep level. I was very aware that wasn't so common, and that actually when you find those things as a student, you have to be receptive to that. You have to be receptive to taking that on and dedicating your life and dedicating a part of your life to learning those things. Again, it's a relationship. So I think authentic teachers are looking to see if there are some students that are open to having that kind of relationship. And again, this is very different to transient fitness stroke stretching kind of gyms that we see more of now in sort of modern time. One of the reasons I wanted to talk about this is because change isn't necessarily a bad thing. I might be sounding a bit pessimistic on this podcast, but I'm super glad that more people are into yoga. I'm really happy that a lot more people know about it, and that it's like more common, and that more people are into it and they see the benefits of this. I think that it's also just important to understand why things change and how things change. And like I said, I think that when studios turn more into this kind of gym membership thing, and something weird I heard lately. Someone said, "How do you make your business, your yoga business, more attractive?" And someone said, "You need to make it more sexy." To me, this was kind of like, it was such a weird thing to hear, that sex, something being sexy, is being associated with a yoga studio or a yoga brand. And you see this a lot really in the yoga world. You've only got to go onto social media to see that sexuality is definitely associated to selling things. This is a standard selling product, but it's definitely associated to yoga. It's definitely fallen into that realm of making something more sexy in a way, and that being more appealing. And it totally shows you how things have really shifted in the yoga world. Like I say, visiting this chap's studio this week, there was nothing sexy about this place whatsoever. The room was not attractive. There was nothing attractive about it. But what I felt in that room, I could feel it. If I was to close my eyes and have a vision of what that room felt like, I felt myself immediately go in, like immediately. I could feel it in that room. It was my senses would drop inward. That's why I wanted to practice there. There's different feelings you get from different rooms, like I said, but I could feel I did a podcast the other day about Dharana and Pratyahara. Like my senses were withdrawn in that space. Yeah, it was definitely not external. It wasn't sexy. It was an internal thing. I felt yoga in that room again. What is yoga? It's not external sexiness. Yeah, it's not leggings and bums and muscles and things like that, or whatever's being associated to yoga in that way. It's not that. It was an internalized thing. And again, I think the more that spaces move into the externalization of these things, I think that those things start to get more associated to those things, and then people's attention spans are more drawn to that dopamine hit of what's attractive. It's like sex sells, certain aesthetics sell. I'm not against beauty, totally for beauty, but it's interesting that those things are being associated to studios or practitioners and their brand as a way to promote selling yoga. It's to make it kind of sexy. I think it was an interesting thing to sort of think about. But so I think that those spaces are kind of dying off a little bit. And like I say, I felt that energy there, that those kinds of spaces they're still valid. And I think there are definitely students that are drawn to those spaces. But I would definitely say the younger generation are not. I would assume the younger generation don't really see that. And they're not really drawn to those kinds of spaces for yoga practice. As yoga has become more mainstream, they see it more as a sort of fitness industry. And I think that that's a big shift that's gone on since I started doing yoga, because to me those things were not even in the same world. Like a gym with weights and classes with music and dance, that had nothing to do with yoga. It wasn't even, I wouldn't even have thought of that. It was like, I didn't even associate that. But nowadays I think those things are very much associated. So that is a big shift. And I think that people who are trying to teach authentic practices, who are potentially competing with studios that are more in this sort of fitness model, it's those things are popular. So I think because yoga's become more of a stretching strength thing and people want a workout, I think that the competition between those two worlds is obviously apparent. And I think that that's potentially why some studios, some shalas that are teaching more authentic traditional practices are probably struggling more, because the big chain places that are offering all of these discounts, and you can have a sauna, you can have this, you can have that, people just see it as like, oh, I'm getting more, I'm getting more for what I'm paying, but really what you're getting more of is not yoga. You're getting more of an externalized gym membership. I've also heard people talk about this in community pages where someone will say, well, I can't afford to go to yoga and pay for a gym membership at the same time. And like I say, it's the same. It's being grouped into the same thing. Your gym membership is kind of the same as your yoga membership, because it's seen as just as a physical stretching thing. So if you had to weigh up the two, you might drop your yoga membership because you still want to do stretching and strength work at the gym, because it's grouped in the same way. It's not seen. When I went and visited this chap last week, there was nothing stretching strength related in that room. I could feel a religious nature to that space. I could feel knowledge, wisdom. I could feel a calm energy. I could feel a presence of yoga. I could feel a presence of something else, something you was curious about, something that wasn't so physical. This is a yoga space. It's more of a place of learning. Not just a physical studio where you sweat and stretch. I think that, again, it's a discrepancy, but they're two different worlds. And I think I don't know how many more spaces are like that anymore, where you have that kind of feeling in those rooms. They do exist, but there is a competition between those two worlds in a way. And I think that probably the younger generation of members are more drawn to the kind of fitness gym membership kind of model. Also, I've heard a lot of people moving to like online things, and I think that's very apparent in yoga, and I actually don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that there's benefits to learning educations online, and I think that there's space for that. I think the ease of use, and people like to practice at home, and I think having access to things like that can be really beneficial. And I think you'll get a certain amount of energy from that, and you'll learn something that's more convenient, and I think that there's benefit to that. But that's very different to going to a space in a community where you know people and you physically see people and you physically touch people and you're in that space. That's a completely different thing. I think that they both have their own benefits, but going to a space where there's a community energy and you see people and you feel people, and that's the stuff you remember. Yeah, it's not convenience isn't necessarily the things that make your life more fulfilled. Yeah, committing to something, turning up, helping people, supporting people, that requires effort and energy. It requires your input into something. But that's the thing that you're going to remember. That's the thing that you're going to feel more like, that's going to make you get up in the morning. Yeah, feeling connected to people makes people happier. Not feeling connected, disassociated, disconnected, disembodied, alone, doing things on the internet is definitely more like that. Yeah, you're not going to get those feelings from it. You're not going to remember that. Yeah, when I think about all the practices I've had over years, going to certain spaces and the people that were there and sharing that energy with people, that's the stuff that makes life worth living. Yeah, not disconnected chain gyms where everyone's got headphones on and no one even looks each other in the eye. I mean, these places are soulless. They're dead. They're just dead. They're like that. There's lots of gyms like that in Oslo where it's just, people go in, do their thing, leave, and it's cool, it's convenient, and it's quick, and it's, but there's no memory there, there's no feeling there, there's no soul there. You don't remember anything from that. It's disconnected in a lot of ways, if you ask my opinion. But it's quite like that. I think it's sad that yoga is potentially becoming more like that. It's more of a in and out, quick fix, disconnected thing. I think that that's sad. I think that really yoga to me is about community spaces. It's just about places that people come together and connect and share a common interest. And I think that we have to value those things. That's the point I'm trying to get over in this podcast, is that if you don't want those kinds of spaces to die out, you have to value those things. And, recently talking to some other senior teachers, I think some teachers are going to stop teaching these practices, actually. I've even, it's something I've thought a bit about myself, like in a way that sharing these things is important. And I think the people that are the most authentic people I know that do this, they don't really do it for the money. They do it because they care. They do it because they're trying to share something that has value. And I think that you have to value people like that. In my opinion, people who teach things from an authentic place that's true, with love, they're gold. When you find people like that, you have to really value people like that, because there's an energy there. There's something that you can learn, and something that can be life-changing from spaces like that has nothing to do with convenience, discounted prices, and class passes and things like this. It's got nothing to do with that. It's an exchange. It's a beautiful exchange of something that is completely deeper and has more wisdom in it than whether you're getting a discounted price at a gym. It's sad that those worlds have got combined in some ways, and that the need to compete and stay alive for some studios is kind of pushed that energy of being competitive and pricing and offering different things. But what you're offering in yoga has got nothing to do with that. That deeper wisdom and that exchange of knowledge and that care that someone has in a space is super rare. It's not an easy, it's not it should be valued. I remember recently reading about a very famous Lama in Tibet, who lives, in quite a remote part of the Himalayas. And the students that practiced with him, he had 3 students, young aspiring students. They had to go through a very arduous, long process to be accepted to be taught these methods. And the reason is because I think when some teachers have reached a certain level of what they've learned and what they want to share, it's not really any point sharing that to people who are half-assed, or, not really that interested, or see it as a transient thing. You had to kind of show that you had a willingness to go there. I think I felt that with my teachers in martial arts. It was like, I definitely showed to my teachers, like, hey, I want to learn this from you. You had to kind of show up, put the energy in, and be present, and you had to commit to that thing. And I think that, again, the best things are learnt when there is a two-way relationship. And I think that the spaces that you get the most from are the spaces where that exchange happens. And I think that if there's authentic senior teachers out there who are not getting that from students, because students are seeing yoga as a transient, superficial thing that is kind of easy come, easy go, they'll stop doing it. And I think that that's a bit sad, really, and that that wisdom will maybe die off a little bit, or it won't get shared in the correct way. There should be those kinds of spaces are special. I think that I'm just highlighting that to say that, like when I met this chap recently, it's kind of sad to think that people like that might stop teaching what they're doing, for the economical reasons outlined in this podcast, but also from how students are seeing yoga practice potentially as this sort of class pass gym membership. Lastly, I might just say this, that this is getting talked about a lot lately, but maybe people are just really largely just interested in the physical side. And I think that the deeper roots of yoga and what what it means, is kind of becoming less important. One of the reasons I've done a series on the 8 limbs of Ashtanga on this podcast lately is to remind people that this is a religious practice. This is a deeply spiritual practice that connects you with something that you don't understand. It's divine in that way. And I'm talking from experience. I think from Instagram, social media and things like that, it's just become a very physical, externalized thing. And I think that it would be good to remind people and get back to what these systems were created for. And I think we need them now more than ever. The more people become disconnected, disembodied, these practices become more important. That's less about the physical side. It's actually more about the deeper roots of what yoga is and what the intention of these practices are. And again, I think the more that studios move into just this externalized distraction environment, the real root meaning of what these practices were about start to get watered down, and people will just associate yoga with stretching and strength work and being distracted by music. And I think that, again, it has its place, but I think that the authentic places will start to die off, and I think that that's sad. And it just couldn't be, that's the way things are and the way things are transitioning, and maybe yoga might go that way a little bit. But I think that people need, in my opinion, especially for meeting younger people, they don't need more distractions. They don't need more transient spaces that are disconnected. They need community. They need meaning. Yeah, I did a podcast about nihilism with Christian Clicks not too long ago, or maybe it was a while ago now. But you can see this, I think, in the younger generation. Like having meaning to your life, reasons to be places. Yeah, yoga, spirituality will give you a deeper meaning to your life than some transient sort of fitness model. And again, I think that if you're just getting into yoga for stretching and strength work, it's cool. You'll get a lot of benefit from that. But the deeper meanings to these teachings and what they give you in terms of your meaning to your life, about the meaning of who you are and answering the deeper questions that a lot of us have, you're going to get this from traditional, authentic practices and teachers. And I hope that those places don't die off, because they're important. And again, I think that this is an important period where people are a bit lost, with a lot of religions and religious practices sort of being demonized and frowned upon. people have become much more sort of science and technology focused, and there's no meaning in that. Yeah, there's no real meaning to the deeper aspects of life and humanity and love with technology and science. This doesn't answer those questions. Religious practices, the divine, a connection to something deeper and greater, answers these questions. It fills people's hearts with love, connection, and it brings communities together. This science, technology doesn't really do that. Yeah, it's disconnected, disassociated, disembodied, and I think that younger people need that. They need meaning in their life, and I believe that these practices can cultivate that. Probably said enough on this. So like I say, just to finish, the answer to our yoga studios dying, I think, is yes and no. I think some aspects are probably becoming more popular, some aspects not. There's definitely some economical reasons to it, but yeah, I think to support your local spaces, and again, value the relationships you can have and the community that you can have from participating in these kinds of spaces. Ciao.